space that you're in, if you want to close your eyes for a moment and just sit with your breath and just tell yourself to be here. Open yourself up to receive and set the intention to learn with an open mind and an open heart. And here we are, ready to begin. So, as always, if you have any questions as we go through this, just feel free to unmute yourself and ask a question. Or if you just take notes and we want to discuss it later in our one-on-one, that's all good. Whatever works for you. I'm just here to guide you. So as we start talking about the practice of Zen, we want to focus on what it's all about. And so what is it? So Zen, and when we talk about the practice of Zen, there are a few basic essentials that I want to focus on through this workshop. But first off, we need to recognize that Zen, the practice of Zen, isn't a religion, it is a practice. Now, it has been adopted and moved into some other practices as well, but it comes from, if you study the history of meditation, mindfulness, Zen, all this stuff, it comes from a bit of Hinduism, a bit of Buddhism, and it's just developed into a practice. When you think about the concept of Zen, the culture that took it on more than any other in the whole world is the Japanese culture. And Zen is connecting to a bit of simplicity, a less overcomplicated world, a lot of acceptance, presence, love and compassion and wisdom and knowledge, and those are just the essential basics of it. There's so much more to it, and I'm not going to get into the whole concept of teaching the dogma of it or the rules that some people put on it, but truly the practice of Zen is allowing things to be as they are. So we'll start right here. This gives a really simple, good explanation of the practice. And as it begins, I'm going to ask somebody to give me a thumbs up to make sure you can hear the words or the song. It takes a moment. Patience. Can you hear that?
A great Zen master called Tozan once wrote, "The blue mountain is the father of the white cloud. The white cloud is the son of the blue mountain. All day long they depend on each other without being dependent on each other. The white cloud is always the white cloud. The blue mountain is always the blue mountain." This was Tozan's interpretation of life, that each of us, like the white cloud, exists dependently, yet independent. When conditions change, the cloud changes, and it just keeps going, leaving no trace, no past. This is the Zen way, without effort, without intention. If there is a sound, we hear. If our eyes are open, we see. There is nothing more than this. When we see ourselves as a white cloud, when we come to this realization of ourselves, it will be enough, and there is no confusion. To awaken to this realization is the practice of Zen. Like a stream flowing down the mountain that finds its own path, living with nature is finding your own way. This is the way of the Tao, and it is found in Zen. If we try to block the stream or resist it, it will simply go around without a pause. It will find its own way. This way is like a fallen leaf moving along a stream. If you allow the stream to carry you, its strength becomes yours. You are one with nature. Without clinging, without attachment, leaving the past behind, living in this moment. When you look at the forest, do not look at the trees as separate or apart, but as one. This is the forest. Likewise, do not differentiate yourself as apart from others or from the world outside. The search for self-realization is powered by our anxieties and our fears, which feed our ego, causing frustration with our daily life. Selfishness, jealousy, anger, and hate, which unconsciously serve to protect us, and in doing so, set us in opposition to everyone and everything. To awaken to this realization is the practice of Zen.
So, it's a simple practice overall. Simple but complicated. Simple but beautiful. Pretty amazing when we focus on what it's all about. So, as we focus and move forward in this teaching, in this practice, we have to embrace the simplicity of it, but understand, first off, again, as I said, it's not a religion, it's a practice, but it is getting into this space where we're redefining of the self. So much of our life and the way we are raised, we get stuck in that ego space where it's me against the world, or we stand in our own indignation rather than saying that I am part of the world and that I should open myself up to be embraced by the community, by the world, by everything, and open ourselves up to embrace that beautiful flow, allowing ourselves to connect to the wholeness and the connectivity of it all. We tend to set ourselves in opposition to everything around us, seeing a tree as separate from us, or everything that we see as separate from us, and also the people that we see, where the truth is we're all together and we're all part of it. It's also, in our practice, it's bringing the mind, body, and spirit together, because a lot of times we put those things in opposition. When we can bring the mind and body together in mindfulness, we start to connect deep down into the spirit, and that's where that wholeness comes, and that's where true holistic healing comes, when we can bring those things together. It's also getting into that space where when we start talking about connectivity in the practice of oneness, that doesn't dismiss the fact that we are unique and that we have a special place and our own certain special set of gifts and purposes to share with the world. But overall, it really is simplicity. We tend to overcomplicate our life and focus on all these things that we need, or places we need to go, but truly, if we just stay present in our life, we can find happiness. We find a calm, peaceful joy just by being present in our life. So, we want to focus on it this way and move ourselves into that space where we let things be what they are, and we let ourselves be as we are. But that doesn't mean I'm giving up. That doesn't mean I'm not going to continue to grow and strive to be better. But when we get into this concept of acceptance, we'll talk about it quite a bit more. Acceptance is allowing us to build a foundation from which we can transform. But radical acceptance and Zen is coming to this space where we emphasize the acceptance rather than the change. Because if we don't get to that place of acceptance, then we're not as likely to be able to change and transform. So, when we focus on this, we would get to this place where we're no longer reaching or striving or trying or wanting or yearning or needing. We're simply being. And most people struggle with that because we have been raised to and taught, and it's demonstrated how we always need to be doing something. You need to be doing something, otherwise you're lazy. You're not accomplishing anything. But in the practice of Zen, in the practice of acceptance, in the practice of meditation and mindfulness, we want to continue to practice connecting to that simple state of being. Because it lets so much of the pressure off. It takes so much of the distraction. It slows down the monkey mind and the over-controlling emotions and gets us out of that ego space and puts us more into a heart space. So the practice of Zen helps us to lessen our suffering, because a lot of our suffering comes from having to have things or expecting things to be a certain way, rather than accepting how things are. Because that suffering comes mostly from outside of the present moment, worrying about the future or regretting the past. In the present moment, yes, on occasion there is suffering in the present, But if we truly dig down deep into it, that suffering is probably attached to something else, something to do with something that happened in the past, or something to do with what might be happening in the future. In our practice of Zen, in our practice of acceptance, we start to allow ourselves to see things as they are. It's an awakening. It's almost like we're pulling the blinders off after a while, where we start to see our emotions as they are. We experience our feelings as they are, and we allow ourselves to settle into that state of being and stop defining ourselves by these things. Emotions are emotions, feelings are feelings, and thoughts are thoughts, but they don't define our being when we see the whole of it. So not being identified by our thoughts or our emotions, but being aware that they are there. And yes, they come from me. I am the thinker of my thoughts and the feeler of my emotions, but they don't define me. It's returning to the simplicity. It's about creating some space and opening ourselves up to move forward. Life as it is allows us to become a bit of a minimalist. And when we practice that, what does that start to do? It starts to quiet the mind. It starts to allow us to connect to those emotions and to feel and be. But the truth is, the concept is beyond words. It just is what it is. But that doesn't mean we're shrugging our shoulders and saying, it is what it is. It means we're coming to that place where we understand what it is, and then we're deciding what to do with that information. This practice can be so powerful when it comes to stress relief, because again, the suffering of stress comes from worried about the future or stuck in the past or connected to things that are beyond our control. When we start to get into that space of being, then we can start to identify what our stressors are and try to put them in perspective or see what we can do to change them. So to practice this in a Zen way and to get into a place where we guide our clients or ourselves to stress relief, we should look at things like our commitments. How committed am I to do all these things in this week, and is it even possible to do it while still accomplishing things and being productive? To practice Zen, we need to become a lot more organized in our life. We might have an organized space around us, but what about our mind? What about our calendar? What about our to-do list? What about all the stuff that people are expecting from us? It's organizing our life, not just the physical space, but the mental and the emotional space. Organizing physical, mental, and emotional. Organizing the body, mind, and soul. One of the biggest practices that we all should coach our clients to be in is to stop overcommitting and stop running late. Whenever we run late, it just adds a layer of stress that's unnecessary. On occasion, we get hung up because something stopped our progress. But to focus on stress relief and to coach people into a place of stress relief is like, give yourself enough time to get from one place to another and set the intention to be early. And if you set your intention to be early, then you're less likely to run late, which is going to be less likely to cause stress, which will help reduce your stress suffering. It's so simple. How come we don't all do that? A big part of our practice, and this is a teaching that came into a workshop 2 weeks ago, and a workshop that came 4 weeks ago, and a workshop that came with Yoga Nidra, is letting go of the need to control everything. We want to be in control for some reason, but we can't. We can't control everything. And coming into this place of acceptance is what we're going to focus mostly on today, and simplifying. One of the tools that we coach to is letting go of people who are toxic in our life. But that concept of letting go of the toxic people in our life, it's an easier concept to say than it is to do. Because we all have people in our life that we can't let go of. Perhaps it's a relative, perhaps it's somebody that we work with, perhaps it's just somebody that is constantly a neighbor, right? I have a neighbor in my building that is very toxic. Every time I get stuck in the elevator, I just want to jump out of it. I want to jump out the window, and there's no window in the elevator. But anyway, we want to bring awareness to these toxic people, and what do we do with that information? We accept them as toxic people, and then we can protect ourselves from them. Maybe not always by kicking them out of our life, but putting them in that space and building that space around ourselves to say, I see you, and I'm not letting you in here. And that's a practice. Zen is a practice of slowing down, because we're all in that space where we're spinning through our life so quickly trying to get to the next big thing, but we need to be Zen. And as we go through this, by the time we're finished, you're going to understand what that even means. Eliminate the negative, be healthy, and practice gratitude. That gets us into that space. So, as we begin this practice, one of my teachers was Marsha Lineman, and she's a psychologist, and she developed this DBT therapy, and one of the tools in DBT is radical acceptance. And so, as one of her videos, and she has plenty of them, Linehan, and she talks about how she got to come to this place of radical acceptance.
I've been transformed by the very therapy that I developed. Because once I realized that I had to teach the clients acceptance, I realized at that very same moment in my own personal life, I had somehow lost my ability to accept, and that I was going to have to learn it myself. And so I ended up taking a sabbatical point or time off from my job. What I found out when I went to the first Buddhist monastery was within days I knew that I had found exactly what my clients needed. I had no doubts about it. I figured that out right away. That acceptance was exactly what they needed, but that they had a way of teaching it that I could translate. My problem was I tried to take it stock and barrel to my clients. At Shasta Abbey, the basic message was all the time to try to radically accept everything and to let go of desires and what you want. So we got jobs every single morning. And so it was the idea of practicing letting go of wanting a particular job. If you were sweeping, they would tell you when the bell rang for work to stop, they would tell you, stop in the middle, because finishing is just your own thing. You're trying to do something you want to do, just let go. So it was this whole practice of just constantly, moment by moment, letting go of what you want and radically accepting what is. It was the first environment I'd ever been in. It was completely non-sexist. I thought I'd die and gone to heaven. I'm not kidding. It was so unbelievable. Men and women would get the same jobs. There was no real distinction. I mean, admittedly, it may not have been helpful if I hadn't just completely thrown myself into it. But since I decided ahead of time that I had to learn this, my only option was just to do everything I was told. You know, just throw myself in. And you know, I was a student, so there were 8 of us. We did everything together. It was really the practice of letting go of having to have what you wanted at any moment. And the recognition that you didn't have to always have whatever it was you wanted. That had a big effect in some ways on the therapy, that in the sense that I try to teach clients suppressing what you want is not the way to go. You have to radically accept that you want something you don't have, and it's not a catastrophe. And so I stayed there for 2 months. Then I went to Germany to the Catholic priest. It was actually the first time in my life I ever talked to someone who actually understood me, the spiritual part of me. Given that my spiritual part of myself is the core of myself, more central than anything else about me, having that understood was an amazing experience. It had a transformative effect on me. What it did is it gave me a home. I am now convinced that it was the practice of radical acceptance every moment that will transform you. I don't have the slightest doubt. It would transform everyone. But it has to be a regular practice. And radical acceptance doesn't mean you don't try to change things, because you only have to radically accept the moment that you're in and the past. But you can try to change the next moment. You can't change anything if you don't accept it, because if you don't accept it, you'll try to change something else that you think is reality. So radical acceptance is simply the radical acceptance that reality is what it is. And if you want to change it, then you work on changing it, which is perfectly legitimate also. But I think it's hard to change something if you don't accept it in the first place.
So I believe you can't change anything fully unless you accept it in the first place. So we're going to go through this practice of radical acceptance as we go through, and notice that a lot of times we are fighting reality. And that's a great coaching tool when we're sitting across from a client listening to what they're telling us, and we say, why are you fighting the reality of whatever it is that happened? It can be used in a relationship issues. If perhaps somebody you're working with had a spouse that cheated on them, you have to come to the reality of the fact that they cheated. And what are you going to do with that information? You can't change it, so you have to accept it. But that doesn't mean you're saying it's okay. It just means I accept that it is the reality of what happened, and I get to choose what I'm going to do with that. Because a lot of times when something bad happens in our life, we go through all the stages of grief, and some of those stages of grief are denial. Well, living in denial is never going to get anyone into that place of transformation. It's turning the mind towards acceptance. I accept it. I accept that this thing happened. I don't have to like it, but it's not a catastrophe because I get to choose what I'm going to do next. Yes, it's probably going to change my life if it's something that radical, but I can come and turn towards acceptance. And we can use our body to help by breathing in and just feeling present and saying, I am here. Despite this negative thing that happened, I am still whole and complete. So we can use that practice of mindfulness. But always remember, radical acceptance is a practice. It's that turning towards things. So how do we do that? We turn towards things. We welcome ourselves. We turn towards ourselves. We become a good listener for ourselves. Become that welcoming presence and hold space for yourself and hear the essence of what your response to that is, and always trying to stay present to see what we're going to do next. It takes courage. It takes courage to come into this place of radical acceptance. But one of the things that we need to coach through is the fact that we are taught to deny so many things that are normal in our life. This rigid denial is what leads us into all these places that we don't really want to be. But rigid denial doesn't work, but radical acceptance does. We get into that space where we resist all the things that are part of our life to the point that we're almost numb, or when something does bad happen, it's like it's the end of the world, when it really isn't. We open ourselves up to be more resilient. And resilience is the word that Susan David uses a lot. Emotional resilience instead of radical denial or rigid denial.
Hello, everyone.
Hello.
Sawubona. In South Africa, where I come from, Sawubona is the Zulu word for hello. There's a beautiful and powerful intention behind the word, because Sawubona literally translated means, I see you, and by seeing you, I bring you into being. So beautiful. Imagine being greeted like that. But what does it take in the way we see ourselves, our thoughts, our emotions, and our stories that help us to thrive in an increasingly complex and fraught world? This crucial question has been at the center of my life's work, because how we deal with our inner world drives everything. Every aspect of how we love, how we live, how we parent, and how we lead. The conventional view of emotions as good or bad, positive or negative, is rigid. And rigidity in the face of complexity is toxic. We need greater levels of emotional agility for true resilience and thriving. My journey with this calling began not in the hallowed halls of a university, but in the messy, tender business of life. I grew up in the white suburbs of apartheid South Africa, a country and community committed to not seeing, to denial. It's denial that makes 50 years of racist legislation possible, while people convince themselves that they are doing nothing wrong. And yet, I first learned of the destructive power of denial at a personal level, before I understood what it was doing to the country of my birth. My father died on a Friday. He was 42 years old and I was 15. My mother whispered to me to go and say goodbye to my father before I went to school. So I put my backpack down and walked the passage that ran through to where the heart of our home, my father lay dying of cancer. His eyes were closed, but he knew I was there. In his presence, I had always felt seen. I told him I loved him, said goodbye, and headed off for my day. At school, I drifted from science to mathematics to history to biology, as my father slipped from the world. From May to July to September to November, I went about with my usual smile. I didn't drop a single grade. When asked how I was doing, I would shrug and say, okay. I was praised for being strong. I was the master of being okay. But back home, we struggled. My father hadn't been able to keep his small business going during his illness, and my mother alone was grieving the love of her life, trying to raise 3 children, and the creditors were knocking. We felt as a family financially and emotionally ravaged, and I began to spiral down, isolated, fast. I started to use food to numb my pain, binging and purging, refusing to accept the full weight of my grief. No one knew, and in a culture that values relentless positivity, I thought that no one wanted to know. But one person did not buy into my story of triumph over grief. My 8th grade English teacher fixed me with burning blue eyes as she handed out blank notebooks. She said, "Write what you're feeling. Tell the truth. Write like nobody's reading." And just like that, I was invited to show up authentically to my grief and pain. It was a simple act, but nothing short of a revolution for me. It was this revolution that started in this blank notebook 30 years ago that shaped my life's work, the secret, silent correspondence with myself. Like a gymnast, I started to move beyond the rigidity of denial into what I've now come to call emotional agility. Life's beauty is inseparable from its fragility. We are young until we are not. We walk down the streets sexy until one day we realize that we are unseen. We nag our children and one day realize that there is silence where that child once was, now making his or her way in the world. We are healthy until a diagnosis brings us to our knees. The only certainty is uncertainty, and yet we are not navigating this frailty successfully or sustainably. The World Health Organization tells us that depression is now the single leading cause of disability globally, outstripping cancer, outstripping heart disease. And at a time of greater complexity, unprecedented technological, political, and economic change, we are seeing how people's tendency is more and more to lock down into rigid responses to their emotions. On the one hand, we might obsessively brood on our feelings, getting stuck inside our heads, hooked on being right, or victimized by our news feed. On the other, we might bottle our emotions, pushing them aside, and permitting only those emotions deemed legitimate. In a survey I recently conducted with over 70,000 people, I found that a third of us, either judge ourselves for having so-called bad emotions, like sadness, anger, or even grief, or actively try to push aside these feelings. We do this not only to ourselves, but also to people we love, like our children. We may inadvertently shame them out of emotions seen as negative, jump to solution, and fail to help them to see see these emotions as inherently valuable. Normal, natural emotions are now seen as good or bad. And being positive has become a new form of moral correctness. People with cancer are automatically told to just stay positive. Women to stop being so angry. And the list goes on. It's a tyranny. It's a tyranny of positivity. And it's cruel, unkind, and ineffective. And we do it ourselves, and we do it to others. If there's one common feature of brooding, bottling, or forced positivity, it's this. They are all rigid responses. And if there's a single lesson we can learn from the inevitable fall of apartheid, it is that rigid denial doesn't work. It's unsustainable for individuals, for families, for societies. And as we watch the ice caps melt, it is unsustainable for our planet. Research on emotional suppression shows that when emotions are pushed aside or ignored, they get stronger. Psychologists call this amplification, like that delicious chocolate cake in the refrigerator. The more you try to ignore it, the greater its hold on you. You might think you're in control of unwanted emotions when you ignore them, but in fact, they control you. Internal pain always comes out. Always. And who pays the price? We do. Our children, our colleagues, our communities. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not anti-happiness. I like being happy. I'm a pretty happy person. But when we push aside normal emotions to embrace false positivity, we lose our capacity to develop skills to deal with the world as it is, not as we wish it to be. I've had hundreds of people tell me what they don't want to feel. They say things like, I don't want to try because I don't want to feel disappointed. Or I just want this feeling to go away. I understand, I say to them, but you have dead people's goals. Only dead people never get unwanted or inconvenienced by their feelings. Only dead people never get stressed, never get broken hearts, never experience the disappointment that comes with failure. Tough emotions are part of our contract with life. You don't get to have a meaningful career or raise a family or leave the world a better place without stress and discomfort. Discomfort is the price of admission to a meaningful life. So how do we begin to dismantle rigidity and embrace emotional agility? As that young schoolgirl, when I leaned into those blank pages, I started to do away with feelings of what I should be experiencing, and instead started to open my heart to what I did feel: pain and grief and loss and regret. Research now shows that the radical acceptance of all of our emotions, even the messy, difficult ones, is the cornerstone to resilience, thriving, and true, authentic happiness. But emotional agility is more than just an acceptance of emotions. We also know that accuracy matters. In my own research, I found that words are essential. We often use quick and easy labels to describe our feelings. I'm stressed is the most common one I hear. But there's a world of difference between stress and disappointment, or stress and that knowing dread of I'm in the wrong career. When we label our emotions accurately, we are more able to discern the precise cause of our feelings. And what scientists call the readiness potential in our brain is activated, allowing us to take concrete steps. But not just any steps, the right steps for us. Because our emotions are data. Our emotions contain flashing lights to things that we care about. We tend not to feel strong emotion to stuff that doesn't mean anything in our worlds. If you feel rage when you read the news, that rage is a signpost perhaps that you value equity and fairness, and an opportunity to take active steps to shape your life in that direction. When we are open to the difficult emotions, we are able to generate responses that are values aligned. But there's an important caveat. Emotions are data, they are not directives. We can show up to and mine our emotions for their values without needing to listen to them. Just like I can show up to my son in his frustration with his baby sister, but not endorse his idea that he gets to give her away to the first stranger he sees in a shopping mall. We own our emotions, they don't own us. When we internalize the difference between how I feel in all my wisdom and what I do in a values-aligned action, we generate the pathway to our best selves via our emotions. So what does this look like in practice? When you feel a strong, tough emotion, don't race for the emotional exits. Learn its contours, show up to the journal of your hearts. What is the emotion telling you? And try not to say I am, as in I am angry or I am sad. When you say I am, it makes you sound as if you are the emotion, whereas you are you and the emotion is a data source. Instead, try to notice the feeling for what it is. I'm noticing that I'm feeling sad, or I'm noticing that I'm feeling angry. These are essential skills for us, our families, our communities. They're also critical to the workplace. In my research, when I looked at what helps people to bring the best of themselves to work, I found a powerful key contributor: individualized consideration. When people are allowed to feel their emotional truth, engagement, creativity, and innovation flourish in the organization. Diversity isn't just people, it's also what's inside people, including diversity of emotion. The most agile, resilient individuals, teams, organizations, families, communities are built on an openness to the normal human emotions. It's this that allows us to say, what is my emotion telling me? Which action will bring me towards my values? Which will take me away from my values? Emotional agility is the ability to be with your emotions with curiosity, compassion, and especially the courage to take values-connected steps. When I was little, I would wake up at night terrified by the idea of death. My father would comfort me with soft pats and kisses, but he would never lie. We all die, Susie, he would say. It's normal to be scared. He didn't try to invent a buffer between me and reality. It took me a while to understand the power of how he guided me through those nights. What he showed me is that courage is not an absence of fear. Courage is fear walking. Neither of us knew that in 10 short years he would be gone. And the time for each of us is all too precious and all too brief. But when our moment comes to face our fragility in that ultimate time, it will ask us, are you agile? Are you agile? Let the moment be an unreserved yes. A yes born of a lifelong correspondence with your own heart. And in seeing yourself, because in seeing yourself, you are also able to see others too. The only sustainable way forward in a fragile, beautiful world. Sawubona. And thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
That's always one of my favorite videos to show because it's so powerful and so to the point of what we're trying to get at this whole practice. It gets into that place of acceptance and being with what's there instead of that resistance. It's turning towards the pain, turning towards the emotion and the suffering and even the unpleasant, where we've trained ourselves to turn away from these things, but turning away doesn't resolve them. It allows us to, when we start turning towards, that is how we start to build that agility to go with the flow of life, to understand the good and the bad and the happy and the sad. And it's broadening the awareness of the human experience, that nobody's perfectly happy all the time. And it allows us to get into that space where we can respond from a place of acceptance. Respond rather than relax and dismiss, which is another thing that we tend to be told, is to just dismiss it. I've sat in so many meditations where the guidance is to let go of your negative emotions. Boy, I wish it was that easy. It's not that easy. It's about radical acceptance means we understand, and maybe we don't even define those emotions as negative or positive. They're just emotions, and just is a tough word. And I think in Yoga Nidra I said I'm trying to get that word out of my vocabulary, but it's difficult. So we get into that space where we start to train ourselves to see things differently, to focus in a different way, to perhaps discover that we are emotional beings and that we should come into that place of acceptance that we are, so that we can move forward with that information. So as we continue on, we want to move into and discuss in a little more depth about what radical acceptance looks like when we're sharing it with ourselves and with our clients. It really is the cultivating an openness to what is, rather than denying what is. So in the tradition of Zen Buddhism, which emphasizes acceptance and awareness of the present moment, and allowing ourselves to connect to that and enhance our intuition, and experience these emotions without inhibition, radical acceptance is the process of embracing and connecting, and with that awareness we can learn what we need to do to let go. In the practice of Zen, this is called the middle way, accepting the things that you can't change, being aware of how these things feel, and this acceptance needs to be total and complete and without exception, and that's what makes it radical. It's a change of attitude, acknowledging what is, getting into that space where we move forward with what is. If we don't accept things as they are, but instead get angry or upset or frustrated or blame someone or something else, that creates the suffering. The non-acceptance itself is the suffering itself. It's almost more so than the emotion. It's that not accepting or expecting things to be a different way. So the more we deny the reality of something, the more we suffer. So the remedy is to turn the mind towards the acceptance. It's to stop living in denial, because suffering is worse than pain. Suffering is when the pain is denied and avoided or rejected, because pain heals. We can recover from the pain, but the suffering is what causes us difficulty. So it's hard to accept so many things in our life. How do we accept when somebody that we love passes away? How do we accept the way our parents acted, or the way that person when I was younger mistreated me, or the way others mistreat us in our life? Sadness and anger and resentment are natural emotions, but they become even more painful when we deny them. Denial's a way to avoid these painful thoughts, but denial just increases that sadness and that anger and that resentment. So, the truth is, what we resist persists. Acceptance sometimes softens that. It allows us to shrink it down, to see it, and then to put it in perspective. And sometimes that makes it smaller than it really is. Not always. Or at the very least, it helps us to find ways to make peace with it, or to move forward with it. When we when we find no solution to a problem, it's probably because the problem can't be solved. The truth is to accept it. But that's easier said than done. But practicing the skills of radical acceptance helps us alleviate so much suffering by changing our attitude towards the difficult realities and of the ordinary truths that are part of our life. So some of the things that stand in our way are the fact that we feel um, if we don't accept something, it's going to magically disappear, right? It's going to just go away if I don't accept it. Well, that's a myth. That never is the truth. The other thing we tell ourselves is if we accept this painful situation, then that means it's going to take over our life. Maybe for a little while, but it might take over our life to get us into that space where we find resolution. Another struggle that we have is if we accept this painful situation, then we're accepting a life of pain without end. But how would it end if we don't come to a place where we accept it? It's like, how do we accept things if we're not willing to truly, how do we move forward if we're not really willing to accept? It's like imagine the color purple. And imagine you move into a house that has a room that's purple. Well, if you refuse to accept that the room is purple, then you're going to always walk into that room and not be happy with it, right? You're fighting the reality of the fact that the room is purple, and that causes suffering. Each and every time you go in there, you're like, why would they paint this room purple? Who decided that this room needed to be purple? What were they thinking, right? And that's a little bit of a, superficial suffering, but it truly is. You're getting caught up in judging that purpleness rather than getting to that space where I accept the room as purple, I accept I don't like the color purple, and I can change it. I can paint it. That's the simple truth of it. Now that's oversimplifying how we move through our life, but the truth is when we hold on to things that we don't need, we suffer. If we hold on to things that we don't like, we suffer. We need to surrender sometimes, to trust in the moment, to accept the truth, to see it for what it is, and face the reality of it so that we can change it if we can. And there are some things in our life that we can't change, but we want to move through this radical denial, and we want to practice the skill of acceptance. Practicing the skill of radical acceptance allows us to relieve suffering by changing our attitude towards these difficult realities and rather turning them into ordinary truths. It's true, the room is purple. It's true, I don't like that politician. It's true, I hate the way people drive. I accept it. And then I turn into that place where what am I going to do with that information? Well, I'm going to protect myself from all these crazy drivers out there. I'm going to vote against that politician I don't like. I'm going to paint that purple room. Getting yourself in that space of finding your solution, if there is one. Acknowledging the truth as it is, not the way we want it to be, but seeing that it is that way. And sometimes it's recognizing without what it is without judging or even having opinion about it. Sometimes radical acceptance is enduring the inevitable that there are going to be some days we wake up and it's going to rain. There's going to be rainy days. Maybe I wanted to have a picnic today, but the reality is it's raining. And I could sit there and say, woe is me, I made all these plans and what am I going to do now? Or I could just open my eyes and say, it's raining. What am I going to do? That's what we should focus on. So instead of denying, we want to open ourselves up to the truth, that it is what it is, accepting the painful realities of life, opening ourselves up. Because this suffering can sneak up to us in so many different forms. And some of the things that we tell ourselves is we fall into these excuses that we say, well, does that really matter? Or what if it really does matter? And we convince ourselves that it doesn't matter. Or we fall into these roles of playing the victim. The why? Why did this happen to me? Why is the world out to get me? Why did things not go the way I wanted to go? So instead of focusing on what are we going to do with this thing that happened to us, and maybe understand that it really didn't happen to us and why are we taking it personally, we find our ways to what am I going to do with this information? So what do I do? What do I do? What can I do? How can I change my focus or change the way I'm falling into that thing? So the remedy to suffering is putting ourselves in that place of acceptance over and over and over and over again, turning the mind. The truth is that suffering isn't holding us. We're holding on to that suffering because we're not allowing ourselves to go into that space of acceptance. When we practice this denial, we fall into that place of resentment. But when we have this acceptance, we learn to let go of the denial. So some of the steps that we can take is getting into this place of what are the roadblocks to radical acceptance. So, because the truth is it's easier to understand than it is to practice, but everything we talk about is a practice. When we talk about forgiveness, that's a practice. When we talk about gratitude, that's a practice. And love and compassion and all these other things are practices, but they're worth doing. Think of all the things we practice that aren't really worth our time. So the truth is we need to understand what the obstacles are, and if we're using this as a coaching tool, then we need to be able to teach what the roadblocks are and understand that sometimes we need to work on these. The first one is if I accept something that somebody did, then that means I'm letting them off the hook, right? So we hold on to that anger so that it feels like we're not letting that person off the hook instead of going into that place of accepting. If we let go of our emotions and we radically accept, then that means we're kind of giving up, right? But the truth is that's not how it works. When someone's treated us unfairly, they might not even know that they did, or if they did, perhaps they did it on purpose. So then that means we're giving that person control. If they recognize that their actions were unkind or not helpful, then our anger only serves to distract them from the reality of facing their own failings or their own guilt, because we all get in that space of indignation. I didn't mean it that way, or you're taking it out of context, or whatever it is. I didn't mean to hurt you. But if we let them know, if we speak from our heart and say that really was unkind or unhelpful, perhaps it gets them into that space where they can move forward and ask for forgiveness. Maybe they can recognize their unkindness. But even if they don't recognize it, then does that change anything for us? We need to come into that space where we accept this person and what they did, but that doesn't mean we're saying it's okay. Then we can move into a space where we protect ourselves from that person, or let that person out of our life, or just see them for what they are so that we can move on. It doesn't mean we embrace the person who hurt us or anything that they did to us. It means we're moving forward with that information and we're standing up for ourselves with respect and saying, I see you, and I'm going to do all that I can to protect myself from you in the future. Maybe I move into a space of forgiveness, but I won't forget. I'm going to protect myself, and if it happens again, then of course I know that I made that choice. The same is true when we're angry with ourselves. We should move into a space where we forgive ourselves and move on from the lesson that we just learned, because punishing ourselves doesn't help. The second thing people run into is that they think if we accept, that means we agree. And we get indignant and say, I'm never going to agree. But radical acceptance doesn't mean we're agreeing with a situation or an action. It means we're acknowledging that the event happened and that it is real. Acceptance doesn't mean we're fighting the reality of it. It means we're moving into that space where we're not denying the reality of it. And the language is what's important. This information is true. It means I accept that it happened. I don't have to agree. The suffering is going to lessen when we say, it happened and I'm going to move forward. And the third step most people run into is that we feel that we need to be angry in order to protect ourselves. It's like we're building this wall around ourselves by holding on to that anger. So the anger or the withdrawal or the resentment seem to be like an armor we're putting around ourselves. And we may be feeling that that's a protection, this wall that we're putting up. But the answer is it doesn't protect us. It actually isolates us. It allows us, it blocks us off from finding a way to move forward with it, with the wisdom and the creativity that we have inside. So the truth is we might be using our anger to protect ourselves from the painful feelings that we have deep inside, but that never moves us into a state of resolution. Practicing radical acceptance allows us to understand that we will feel sad and we will feel hurt, but once we allow the feeling to come up, then we can move forward to heal. When we hold ourselves in that place of armor, of protection, then we can never heal. So we run into that place of struggling. So one of the biggest myths to radical acceptance means agreeing with what happened. People assume that that acceptance means approval. And that's why we call it radical acceptance, because it's not approval. Acceptance doesn't mean approval. Acceptance means we move into this state where I am accepting it, but I'm not resisting I'm accepting it and not resisting the reality of it, so that I can move forward to a place of heal. Fighting reality only causes suffering. The reality is that pain is inevitable, but suffering is optional. And suffering is what happens when we refuse to accept the pain in our lives. So, when we're working with people, when we're working with our clients, when we're working with ourselves, we understand that when someone passes away or something dies, we accept their passing. We focus on coping with the pain and grief instead of refusing to accept that the grief is there. If we don't accept it, then we can never come into that place of healing. But acceptance doesn't mean we're throwing our hands up in the air and waving the white flag. The truth is, we consider what it feels like. We open ourselves up to say, what am I going to do with this? And how am I going to move forward with it? It's a practice. It's difficult. But acceptance doesn't mean approval. Acceptance means we're going to find a way through it. With acceptance, our suffering dissipates, but a lot of times the pain is still there. The pain is that signal that we need to take some steps to move into that space of healing. But suffering, it almost blocks us off from that, because suffering blocks us from that place of healing. The pain becomes more bearable when we move into that space where we're taking action to move forward, because what we resist is going to persist, but what we accept allows us to take action and move forward without the pain and suffering. Acceptance. Each and every moment that we sit in meditation, we're moving into a state of acceptance. We're allowing ourselves to move into this space of saying, I see you, I understand. I don't have to approve, but I understand, and I'll move forward with that information. It requires us to look upon ourselves and to look at others and look at the world in an entirely new way. We have to be willing to let go of the ideas of how we think things should be and simply accept things as they are. Not approving, but accepting in the present moment. And when we accept something, we're completely releasing the judgment of it and avoiding any attempt to fight the reality of what it is that's going on. Acceptance.
Acceptance is a very active process. There's nothing passive about it. It's not passive resignation, but it's an active recognition that things are actually the way they are. Sometimes they're not the way we want them to be. So acceptance doesn't mean that we can't work to change the world or to change circumstances of one kind or another, but it means that unless we accept things as they are, we will try to force things to be as they are not, and that can create an enormous amount of difficulty. If we recognize the actuality of things, then we have the potential to apply wisdom in that situation to actually shift our own relationship to what is occurring in ways that might be profoundly healing and transformative. But without acceptance of one's situation, then it's very difficult to know where to stand. And without knowing where to stand, it's very difficult to take the first step. So some things are very hard to accept, like when something, when you experience pain, for instance, and you don't, in your body, and you don't know what it's from. It's very, very difficult to accept it because we want to know what it's coming from. And if we don't have any answer for what is causing the pain, then it can be very, very difficult to accept it. But what we find working with chronic pain patients is that before you can actually work with pain and suffering, you need to actually put out the welcome mat for it and accept it as it is, because whatever has been done medically that could be done has been done, and you're still living with a certain degree of pain. What our people with chronic pain who come to our clinic experience is that there's a lot of different ways to actually work with pain, but the first step is to actually put out the welcome mat for it, which is very hard to do when you're suffering, but it's actually a gateway into freedom from suffering. So that's one of the most powerful ways in which acceptance can be brought to bear on healing and transforming one's life, and is a very, very powerful factor and is a very, very powerful attitude in the cultivation of mindfulness.
Every time I watch that video, I feel like he fell asleep right at the end. Like, wait, wake up, you're not done yet. Anyway, one of the ways we can focus on this practice of radical acceptance is that we need to understand that when we're sitting in the present moment, that present moment just didn't leap into existence because we decided to sit and breathe and to focus. The present moment was there. So the present moment doesn't leap into existence without being caused by everything that happened before, everything that's taken place before. So when we can almost imagine that this moment is, that each and every moment in our life is like connected by dominoes, and you know how dominoes fall into one, if you put them into a line, they fall into each other. They're connected. So the idea is that this present moment is the consequence of everything that's happened before. Some of those things were caused by us, some of them were caused by other people, and some of them were just caused by the world and the way things are. So it doesn't do any good to look back at those things and try to place blame on them, to try to point fingers or to be offended by them. Because the reality is that no matter who caused them or where they came from, they are here. And we are the ones that have to deal with them. We have to accept the good and the bad and the in-between. The reality is that no matter who caused them, we are the ones that have to deal with the circumstances. And it's in our best interest to accept this moment precisely as it is so that we can change, so that we can get our feet beneath us and say, what am I going to do with this information? What am I going to do with this right now? And when we accept the reality of the present moment, we're allowing ourselves the opportunity to recognize and to take responsibility for the role that we're playing in our life. This is my life, and I get to choose what I'm going to do with it. I might not like everything that's happening around me, but I get to choose what I'm going to do with it. And that's the truth. That's the truth. And we can choose to ignore it, or we can choose to take action. Because the thing is, as we get to this point in our life, as anyone gets to some point in our life, rarely can we blame everything on one person. So when we're able to assume the responsibility for our life, for all the things that were beyond our control, and for the choices that we made, then we're able to take an enormous step forward, take a whole lot of power back to ourselves, so that we start to build our way forward. so that we start moving to that place of healing, so that we start to enable ourselves to say it's okay to feel happy, it's okay to be proud. It allows us to be fulfilled because we are the ones taking control. Instead of denying, we're moving forward, because denial never wins. The reality of life can be painful, and it's natural to want to push things away. But the reality is, we can't live in denial. We need to move into this place of acceptance. And we should move into this place where we can coach the people we're working with to come to a state of acceptance. And there are some steps and there are some tools that we can take. And one of the best ones, of course, is meditation. And then we have some affirmations that we can use. They're in your binder, but some of the best ones that I like to use is we say to ourselves, right here is where I'm supposed to be. Where I am right now is a result of a million other decisions. Or thinking of the past robs me of the present. Or what I do in this moment is all that I have control over. Every event in my life has brought me to the now, and the present moment is perfect, even if I don't like it, because we've never experienced this moment before, and everything that we've done has brought us to this moment. And right here is where I'm supposed to be. And this moment is a result of everything that's happened to me before. And wallowing in the past is robbing me of the opportunity to be present and to take action. All of those things are the reality of life, and this is how we move forward from a place of radical